Talking with Jerry.
Hey Jerry, hey man, thanks for having me on the podcast. But I have actually two questions, but my first question is a two-part.
All right.
Did you say stop?
No, I said good. You know, we're talking this evening about my experience of having a 360 experience with growing up in Harlem, listening to Malcolm X talk on the street corner, of course, seeing him develop the Nation of Islam, the mosque, before there even was a mosque on 116th, and then growing up into adulthood and working with his attorney, Mr. Percy Sutton, and meeting Alex Haley, who wrote his autobiography, spending time with him, and then the irony of meeting one of the assassins who I was counseling in prison, who actually was one of the murderers, or the only convicted murderer who admitted to his killing and spent time in prison. So, yeah, this is going to be a nice, interesting, short discussion. So let's go.
Okay, very quickly so others can chime in. My first question is two parts. You know, Malcolm surrounded himself with good people. One of them, you mentioned a guy, Percy Sutton. Tell us how important was Percy to New York, and even more so, how did he influence you as a New York City businessman?
Sure. Well, Percy had a great background. He was from Texas. He was a Tuskegee Airman, then relocated to New York City. He always had a vision of either being on the radio or having something to do with a radio station, and that came later in his career. But as a early attorney, he ended up representing Malcolm X. And when I was growing up in Harlem as a youngster, and Malcolm would be speaking on 125th Street, he would always have certain prominent people from the community there. And one of those people was Percy Sutton, who there are many photographs with Malcolm speaking on 125th and Percy being right there. And he went on, of course, Percy, to own Inner City Broadcasting, which at one time was the largest black radio station chain. He was the owner of the Apollo Theater and had a lot to do with the invigoration of 125th Street making a comeback after it went downhill in the 70s and early 80s. And he was also a pioneer for black advertising at a time when black radio stations didn't have toothpaste advertisers and airlines, but because BLS was such a big station, he was able to break those barriers.
Mm-hmm. So how did he influence you as a New York City businessman?
Well, I think Percy, as a role model and being someone that worked with Malcolm, representing him as his attorney, was gave him a set of skills being tied to our community and working not only with an icon, but someone who was a champion and a leader for black people at a time when people didn't see that. You didn't see a black man standing up to the system, to society, to what you might call the police state or to the government. And then Malcolm, as we know, which we'll talk about briefly, did that on the international level. And for those of you who saw the movie Malcolm X, I mean, he was an inspiration for everyone in Harlem at that time because his speeches, as you know, being a Harlemite, on 125th Street, up on 115th Street and Lenox Avenue, I mean, they would almost have to shut the street down because there would be so many people out there listening to Brother Malcolm.
Mm-hmm. And my second question, Jerry, you mentioned the nation and how they were, necks were straight, heads up, bow ties, shoes shine. inspire and let that influence us to come to now Yeezys, man.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm not going to get too much into that because that's another show that I'm doing about Kanye. No, but I understand where you're going from. Where do we
Right.
go from Malcolm telling us to carry ourselves a certain way, be a certain way, and you saw brothers who were on drugs were no longer using drugs and their faces cleared up. You saw guys who maybe used to dress a certain way. You could even remember from the movie how Malcolm dressed and then how he made that transition once he got under the influences of Elijah Muhammad to wear a suit all the time, a proper fitting suit too, by the way, not a zoot suit, and the bow tie. And as a youngster, we were all impressed. But what I had the advantage of was before Malcolm created and built the mosque on 116th and Lenox, the Nation of Islam used to meet at the Armory up on 143rd Street. And I lived on 142nd Street, directly across from the Armory. So every Sunday I would see the brothers out there, shoes shine, excuse me, well dressed, suits, bow ties, lined up, military style, didn't take no mess, and that was very impressive upon me, and made me as a young person want to hear Malcolm speak in his speeches. And I can remember one Saturday, my mother and I being on 125th Street and just spending a few minutes listening to him, and he was such a great orator. And at that era, we had a lot of great speakers. We had President Kennedy, who was one of the best. We had Martin Luther King, and then of course the great Malcolm X. So yeah, him and Percy, those two people at that era in Harlem in the 1960s, 1970s was, well, I would say 1960s at that point, was a very key time in Black history. So
Well, Terry, let me say this, man. It's a great story, and I want to chime in quick, so I'm gonna let others have room, and I'm gonna keep listening and enjoy your segments as we continue enjoying your podcast, my friend.
thank you. So my further connection, which was a strange connection, was I used to work with inmates in, let's say, a correctional facility. It was something I was doing in the evening through a federally funded program. And in this particular program, I work with inmates to help them prepare to get ready to go back out into society and adjust to the world that they had been removed from, whether it was for 2 years, 5 years, 20 years, 30 years. It was somewhat of a difficult task, but it was a challenge as a young person that I took on, and got inspiration from many of the inmates, learning about why they ended up in prison, how they wanted to come out and change their lives, and trying to do something positive myself to help them. So this one particular sessions that I was doing over a number of weeks with the same group of inmates, this one particular week, there was one inmate that, we kind of made eye contact, and by the third session, you kind of look at somebody and you say, hey, maybe I know this person from somewhere, but you don't approach them. That's not something that's done. And my last session with this group, that particular week, all the individuals, that small group, came up to me one by one. They thanked me. We chatted for a few minutes. I wished them best of luck. But this same individual stood in the back of the room, waiting to talk to me after everyone left. I thought it was a little strange, but then he came towards me and we shook hands. We chatted for a minute, and I wished him best. And I said to him, I feel like I know you from somewhere. I've seen your face. Did you grow up in Harlem? And he said, no, I'm not from Harlem. He didn't say where he was from, and he just said that he enjoyed the presentations that I had made, and he was looking forward to putting those things to use once he got back out into society. So he left, and the CO, which means corrections officer, that was there with me, it was my time to leave. I packed up my items, put in my briefcase, and we're walking to the elevator to go downstairs for him to escort me to leave the building. So I said to him as we got on the elevator, I said, it's very strange that individual, the last inmate I was just talking to, I feel like I know him from somewhere. His face looked familiar. It was just like a strange connection. So the elevator started to go down to the first floor, and right when it hit the first floor, he said, "Oh, you do know him." And I said, "I know him?" He said, "Yeah, you do. That's the man who killed Malcolm X." So the elevator door opened, and he got off, and my feet were stuck. I couldn't move because I had just spent time, again, talking with this individual at length, had shook his hand, and this was the man who killed one of my heroes. Perhaps one of, some may beg to differ, one of the most greatest icons in African American history, at least here in the United States. So, but you have to learn to separate those things. I mean, whether it's someone that's incarcerated for raping a nun or a triple homicide, whatever. But it was a very stunning moment for me, and it's something that I carried around for a while. It took me a couple of weeks almost to kind of shake that, but I knew that I had helped that individual and that hope that he was move on with the rest of his life. I would just say that another 360 on this is that flying from New Orleans to Atlanta one week, I make my way to a seat on the plane, and sitting next to me is Alex Haley, who wrote the autobiography of Malcolm X, and also, as you know, wrote the book Roots, which was one of the best-selling books of all time, and the most watched television series in the history of television. That's back when we only had, three networks: CBS, NBC, and ABC. There was no cable back then. But I had a chance to sit next to Mr. Haley and pry him for close to 2 hours about his time with Brother Malcolm X and writing the autobiography and what was Malcolm like, just us interrupted in that conversation. And it was really something that was very, very inspiring for me. And then, of course, in the beginning, we were talking about Mr. Sutton, and I did get have many opportunities to be around him more or less one-on-one or a small group, and that was also something that I enjoyed, having an opportunity to bring up to him questions about Brother Malcolm. What was he like? What kind of person was he? Other than reading a book, what was some other personality traits that drove him to be who he was? And he was really a great, great leader for our people. And still years later, great stories come out about Malcolm. There's one that's on YouTube for those who would want to find it. And it's the released FBI tape of two FBI agents who go to Malcolm after he left the nation and warn him that he was in grave danger for his life. And they're basically saying to Malcolm, cooperate with us. We'll maybe help protect you. We could even relocate you and your family, but we need some help from you. We've got a couple of questions like how many members are in the Nation of Islam? And you can hear this tape and how Malcolm, though he's getting this information, he's still on code and says, I don't know how many members the Nation of Islam has. You'll have to ask the Honorable Elijah Muhammad for yourself. And they continue to pepper him with questions. And I don't like to buy into the no snitching, not that that was what this was about. But the way he handled those two FBI agents was beyond anything that I even think an actor as great as Denzel, if they had put that in the film, would have been able to depict to an audience. So in closing, there was nobody like Malcolm. And as I said, meeting the one convicted assassin of Brother Malcolm and working with him and counseling him, though I did not know this to the end, was a very touching experience in my life. And how poignant that we're talking about this tonight, because just this week, the city of New York settled with the two wrongly convicted men of the killing of Malcolm X. Unfortunately, one of them passed away a few years ago. So I'm sure his family and his daughter and other family members will share the settlement that the city made. But the city of New York, its police department, the FBI, and I'm sure though the CIA is not supposed to deal with activities here in the United States, they all knew that those two men were innocent. And they also knew most likely who the other two killers were that day in the Audubon Ballroom. And that's another stain on this country and stain on, the way the government itself, in all capacities, covered up information about the slaying of what was one of our greatest leaders in the black community in America. So this has been a wonderful brief discussion and sharing that 360-degree story about hearing Malcolm as a child. I don't know what the chances would be to hear Malcolm growing up on street corners and see him build the Nation of Islam in Harlem, to then going on to working with his attorney in my adult life through his radio stations, meeting the person who wrote his autobiography, and closing the chapter with meeting and counseling the man that would eventually take Brother Malcolm's life.